Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Streets of New Capenna draft guide. In this video, I'm going to be covering all of the information that you need to get ready for your New Capenna drafts. But before I dive in, I want to remind you that if you enjoy this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel for more draft content, and comment below with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. Let's get started. In this guide, I am going to be covering the set mechanics, the top 3 commons for each color, archetype overviews, combat tricks to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Let's get started with set mechanics. In this set, the mechanics that appear on commons and uncommons are Connive, Casualty, Blitz, Alliance, and shield counters. All of these are new mechanics, so we're going to be going through them one by one. Starting off with Connive, it is an ability on creatures that says draw a card, then discard a card. If you discarded a non-land card, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. It'll trigger in various ways, but for example, with Echo Inspector, it triggers when it enters the battlefield. Next up is Casualty. This is an ability that appears on instants and sorceries, and as you cast the spell, you may sacrifice a creature with power equal to the casualty number or greater, and when you do, you copy the spell. So for example, Join the Maestros has Casualty 2. So if you sacrifice a creature with power 2 or greater, you will copy Join the Maestros as it is cast. Next up is Blitz. It is an ability also found on creatures. It says if you cast this spell for its Blitz cost, it gains haste, and when this creature dies, draw a card, sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So fairly self-explanatory. Next up is Alliance. It is an ability that triggers whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, and then it gives you some sort of benefit. So for example, Witty Roastmaster will deal 1 damage to each opponent when a creature enters the battlefield. And then finally, we are looking at shield counters. It is a new type of counter that is on a creature, and if that creature will be dealt damage or destroyed, you remove a shield counter from it instead. So also fairly straightforward. Moving on to the top commons, starting off with white. At number 1 is Inspiring Overseer. This is just a fantastic card. Honestly, pretty shocking to see it at common. 3 mana for a 2/1 flyer is already kind of close to playable, and then just tacking on a little bit of life gain and card draw is just absolutely fantastic. So this is a premium common in the set. And number 2 is Rafine's Informant. It's a 2 mana 2/1, but the fact that it can filter your draws a little bit with Connive, maybe come into play as a 2 mana 3/2, is quite powerful. And then at number 3 is Celebrity Fencer. It's 4 mana for a 3/2 on its baseline, but it grows over the course of the game, so it almost has to be dealt with at a certain point, which makes it a very powerful common. Moving on to the blue commons, at number 1 is Broker's Veteran. This card is very good because it can start putting shield counters onto your more important creatures when it dies. And so that means that it is really difficult for a Broker's Veteran not to basically trade for 2 creatures, because it'll trade for the creature it dies to, and it'll also then give your other creature a shield counter. So just a fantastic common. At number 2 is Expendable Lackey. It may look small, but it plays really well with the casualty cards, and is also a great card for knocking off shield counters, because you don't really care if your 1/1 dies, because you can just exile it from your graveyard to get another 1/1 that also has evasion. And then at number 3 is Rooftop Nuisance, a card that can function as a bit of a card draw engine and also a way to buy yourself a lot of extra time if you are defensive, but also a great aggressive tool, stopping your opponent's creatures from blocking for 2 full combats, which is quite powerful. Moving on to black, at number 1, we have Murder. This is just a very good removal spell at an efficient rate and instant speed, so a nice number 1 black common. At number 2 is Corrupt Court Official. Again, little creature with the enters the battlefield effect that is going to make your opponent discard a card, and then it can be used to sacrifice or knock off shield counters, so great little card there. And then at number 3 is Deal Gone Bad. It might not look like the highest rate card, but it can kill a decent number of creatures, and it also gets around shield counters, because giving a creature -3/-3 will kill it, because the creature doesn't have the shield counter trigger to protect it. So Deal Gone Bad is just a nice card for dealing with those cards that would otherwise be a little bit troublesome. Moving on to the red commons, at number 1 is Strangle. 1 mana to deal 3 damage is just fantastic, and so this is a great removal spell at number 1. At number 2 is Mayhem Patrol, a great little aggressive creature. It can get in for quite a bit of damage, enable some other creatures to attack if you put the +1/+0 onto them, and also in the late game, if you don't need a 2-drop, you can blitz it to get in a little bit of damage and then sacrifice it to replace itself on the end step. So Pretty nice little card for just 2 mana. And then at number 3 is Exhibition Magician. This card is quite nice for a variety of decks. First of all, if you really care about Alliance, getting the extra 1/1 will give you 2 Alliance triggers from 1 card, which is quite nice. And if you need to fix your mana, creating a treasure token can be quite good as well. So that's why it comes in at number 3. Moving on to the green commons, starting off with at number 1, Jewel Thief. Just so much text on 1 card. It's got Vigilance, Trample, creates a treasure token to help you fix or ramp, and overall is just a fantastic card to have in any green deck. At number 2 is Warm Welcome. This is a card that is going to give you a little bit of card selection and find you another creature to play, while also giving you a 1/1. And as we've been saying, these little 1/1 creatures are really good for sacrificing to things or for knocking off shield counters. So Warm Welcome, a card that is going to dig you towards another card that is hopefully good and also be useful on the battlefield. And then at number 3 is Rock's Pummeler. It may be expensive at 6 mana, but it really does pack a punch. It's really hard to deal with as just a 1-for-1 card because of that shield counter, and it has the potential to do a ton of damage. So that's why Rock's Pummeler comes in at number 3. Now we are going to move on to the Archetype Guides section of the draft guide. And in Streets of New Capenna, it is a little bit different than a conventional set. Instead of 10 2-color pairs, there are 5 3-color wedges that are supported and 5 2-colored allied pairs. So that's going to inform the draft. There's also going to be a lot of overlap between the 2-color archetypes and the 3-color archetype because necessarily those 2-color archetypes are contained within the 3-color families. So we're going to cover the 3-color families first and then the 2-color allied archetypes. Starting things off, we have the Obscura family. This is the more controlling side of the spectrum. It has a lot of 2-for-1 cards. It has a lot of card advantage. It has the Connive mechanic as its featured mechanic, which means that in the late game, instead of drawing a lot of lands, you're going to be able to filter through them more easily to keep hitting action. It's got cards like Quasar, Augur of Agonies, which is going to help stabilize you and slowly chip away your opponent. Nimble Larcenist as a nice card advantage creature that is evasive, so it can also chip away at your opponent. And finally, Obscura Charm as a nice flexible tool to deal with whatever you need to answer at the time. The next family is the Maestro's family. It is a deck featuring the casualty mechanic and also just lots of instants and sorceries and nice value, very mid-rangey, grindy family. It's got the legendary creature Cormella Glamour Thief, not only as a grindy 2-for-1 card, but also as a way to help you cast more instants and sorceries. It also utilizes Corpse Appraiser as a nice 2-for-1, and Maestro's Charm primarily as a removal spell, but also a card that can dig towards more answers or even finish off your opponent. The next family is the Riveteers family. This is an aggressive family that features heavily the Blitz mechanic, which is the more aggressive end of the spectrum for sure. Also some nice sacrifice synergies and just a lot of creatures in general. Mr. Orfeo the Boulder is a nice legendary card that can help your creatures continue to punch through as the game progresses. Crew Captain is a nice aggressive creature that just hits really hard and can even play well with fight spells and things like that, thanks to Indestructible. And then Riveteer's Charm is a great flexible card because it can provide you card advantage or a removal spell, and even Graveyard Hate if that ever comes up. The next family we're going to talk about is the Cabaretti family. This is a family that is all about creatures. There are lots of payoffs for having lots of creatures. It features heavily the Alliance mechanic, which means it cares about when creatures enter the battlefield. It uses Rocco, Cabaretti Caterer, as a way to get more than one creature into play at a time. So in the late game, you can even get expensive creatures into play, but even just getting 2 bodies for 1 card is quite nice. Brazen Upstart is a creature that finds you more creatures when it dies and really has to be dealt with because it does have 4 power and vigilance, so that's a nice addition to the deck. And then Cabaretti Charm does everything you want for this family. It can be a removal spell if you have a lot of creatures. It can be a buff spell if you need to end the game by swinging all out, and then it can also just make you some creatures to get the ball rolling if you need those. The next family is the Brokers family. This is all about shield tokens, gumming up the board, and then controlling the game. A lot of their creatures are really hard to deal with thanks to shield tokens, and then it gets to leverage good card advantage and just solid cards overall. Lagrella the Magpie is a legendary creature that can help deal with pesky permanents on your opponent's side of the board, but also exile some of your own creatures so you have a little bit of an insurance clause once the Lagrella does get removed. Disciplined Duelist is just a great 3-drop creature, hits really hard, and it is even a little little bit hard to remove the shield counters from, because your opponent can't just throw a small creature in the way. They're going to have to block with something sizable and probably lose it in the ensuing combat in order to remove that shield counter because of double strike. And then finally, Broker's Charm is an incredibly flexible charm, pretty much exactly what you want out of your modal spells. It can be card draw, it can kill enchantments, and it can even be a fantastic removal spell, so Broker's Charm is a great spell for this family. Moving on to the 2-color archetypes that are supported within this set. Once again, I want to reiterate that these archetypes can also be kind of subsets of some of the families, but they can also be standalone decks if you do want to be a more streamlined focus deck and you get enough cards for them. The first one we're going to look at is Black-Red, which is a sacrifice-themed deck. Body Dropper is a featured common for this color combination that gets bigger as you sacrifice other creatures, be that whether they're from blitzed creatures or also just generally other effects, and then it can continue to grow and it can even sacrifice creatures itself. Fatal Grudge is another card that rewards you for sacrificing a card. It replaces itself by drawing a card and also makes your opponent sacrifice a creature. And then Forge Boss can also start chipping away at your opponent's life total while you're doing all of this sacrifice. Next up is Green-White. This is a creature deck that cares about citizens. It is a subtype of creature within this set, and so when you're drafting a Green-White deck, then you want to be aware of which of your creatures are citizens, because it will help make your other cards better. The featured common is Civiled Servant, which is a 2-mana 2/3 on its baseline, which is already a great rate, and can even be a 2-mana 3/3 lifelinker if you do have another citizen. There's also the equipment Ceremonial Groundbreaker, which is absolutely fantastic if you're equipping it for 1 mana, because +2/+1 and trample for just a single mana of equipping is a great rate. And then Darling of the Masses can keep your citizens train rolling by giving you multiple citizens with its attacks and also buffing your other citizens. So a nice little cohesive shell for this deck. The next archetype is Blue-Black, and this one cares about having a lot of cards in your graveyard so that you can have 5 or more mana values among cards in your graveyard. So a land will have 0 mana value, and then you'll want to have a mix of converted mana costs within your deck so that you can fill it with a bunch of different mana values to trigger cards, like, for example, the featured common Snooping Newsy, which is a 2-mana 2/2, but if you have a bunch of mana values in your graveyard, it gets +1/+1 and lifelink, which is quite good for a 2-drop, and it also mills you for 2 cards when it enters play to start getting that chain rolling. You also gain access to a card like Tainted Indulgence, which is a 2-mana draw 2 and then discard a card, but if you have reached the late game where you have 5 or more mana values in your graveyard, you just don't have to discard a card. And then finally, it can gain access to a card like Syndicate Infiltrator, which is already pretty solid as a 4-mana 3/3 flyer, but also turns into a 4-mana 5/5 flyer if you can trigger its extra passive ability. So that's pretty nice for Blue-Black if you can fill your graveyard. The next 2-color pair we're going to be looking at is Red-Green. This is a treasure-focused archetype, though I will say that because treasures can tap for any color of mana, you are oftentimes going to want to use these treasure enablers to go into a 3rd color or just play one of the families that includes Red-Green. So this isn't often going to be a standalone Red-Green treasure deck, but you may have a Red-Green treasure package within a larger shell, and so knowing that this is kind of the synergy of the Red-Green color pair is worth knowing. You get Jetmir's Fixer, which is a great 2-drop even without treasure, but if you start buffing it up by giving it +1/+1 counters instead of a temporary +1/+1, it can start to take over the game. Stimulus Package can let you turn your treasures into actual board presence, which is always a useful thing to have. And then Security Rocks is just a good creature as a 4-mana 5/4, but can be even better and lead to some very efficient turns in the mid-game if you do have some extra treasures lying around. And then the final archetype is the Blue-White archetype. This one cares about having counters on your creatures. It is at a nice segue because it can have counters via the Connive mechanic, so +1/+1 counters, or counters via the shield mechanic, because there are some Blue-White cards that come with shield counters. So the featured common is Celestial Regulator. It's a 3-mana 2/3 flyer, so already a good rate. It taps down a creature when it enters play, so that's already good. And then if you do have any counters on your creatures, that creature will remain tapped for a little bit. So just all around a great card, and especially good in a deck that cares about having some counters. Exotic Pets is another card that gets a lot better if you do have some counters, but is already good on its baseline. 3 mana for 2 1/1s that can't be blocked is already pretty good. And then if you have some counters around, you can maybe buff up one of the pets with a +1/+1 counter, or give one of them a shield counter, or something of that nature. And then finally, Metropolis Angel is a 4-mana 3/1 flyer, which is a little bit below rate, but if you are attacking with 1 or more creatures with counters on them, you start to draw cards, which is really nice for taking over a game, and really does incentivize you to get some counters on your creatures. Moving on to the combat tricks, section of the guide. There are quite a few. They are sorted here by their converted mana cost. In white, there is Boon of Safety for just 1 mana, putting a shield counter on a creature and scrying one, which can be a way that you can win combats if you are going to be trading creatures. There's Revelation of Power, which is just +2/+2, and then if you're putting it on something that has a counter, you can sometimes use it as a way to just push damage and end the game. And then at uncommon is Refuse to Yield, which is definitely something to be aware of, but it is worth noting that uncommon combat tricks aren't always worth playing around unless you have a very strong reason to think your opponent has it. In blue, there is Majestic Metamorphosis, a card that can definitely get a ton of value. Just turning one of your little creatures into a 4/4 and then drawing a card as well can certainly be a way to win a combat and gain an advantage. Fake Your Own Death is a really nice combat trick in black, especially if you have cards that have death triggers or enters the battlefield triggers, because since the creature is leaving play and then coming back, you will get those death triggers, you will get those enters the battlefield effects. In red, there are 2 combat tricks: Daring Escape to win those narrow combats by giving +1/+0 and First Strike, and Antagonize to give +4/+3, so those are definitely ones to be aware of. Green also has 2 combat tricks for the family, can give +2/+2 or +4/+4, so definitely keep that in mind, because if the board is getting really crowded, For the Family can definitely really swing a combat for just 1 mana. And then Most Wanted is also one that's really important to be aware of, because it is an enchantment with flash, so it can not only come into play and win a combat, but it'll stick around if you do walk into it, so to speak. So make sure you are aware of Most Wanted. And then finally, Quick Draw Dagger is a common that is colorless, so you are going to see this relatively frequently, and it's going to be able to win those narrow combats as well, and then stick around as an equipment. So keep in mind these combat tricks so you don't just walk into them, especially when you're newer to the format and maybe haven't drafted it as much. Moving on to some trap cards to avoid. First up, Security Bypass. This is the sort of card that looks nice. It has a lot of text on it. It gives your creature evasion, but it also doesn't protect your creature in any way. So if you put this onto one of your creatures and then they kill it, you just find yourself down a card, and the upside of being able to connive every turn and being evasive if it's attacking alone is not worth that risk. And number 2 is Illicit Shipment. This is the sort of card that is really easy to misevaluate. The problem is that in limited, there's not really going to be a card in your deck that is worth paying 5 extra mana to go search up, or 2 cards and sacrificing another creature to go get 2 cards. It's just not going to be happening in limited. You don't want to be giving up that board presence. You want to be affecting the board with your cards. And even though in Commander or in a constructed format, being able to search up a card is very powerful, in limited, your card power level is relatively flat usually. So you're not going to be able to use Illicit Shipment that effectively, and so it's better left on the sidelines. And then at number 3 is Goldhound. This is the sort of card that it has a lot of text on it once again, but as a 1 mana 1/1, it just doesn't have a huge impact on the game. And so if you do just play this and then sacrifice it a few turns later, you're putting yourself down a card for not really that much benefit. So these are just these are cards that you should better leave in the sideboard. Moving on to some combos that you can assemble in New Capenna. First off, the combo between Duskmangler and Graveyard Shift. Duskmangler is a massive creature that has a really impactful enters the battlefield ability, but if you are going to cast it, it costs a whopping 7 mana and also makes you pay a little bit of a big cost as well. However, if you use Graveyard Shift to get it into play, you don't have to pay any of the costs to cast it, but you still get all of the benefits of it entering the battlefield. There are quite a few ways to get Duskmangler into your graveyard. You can use one of your Connive creatures to draw a card and discard a card and discard the Duskmangler, and there are also some ways to mill yourself to put cards directly from your library into your graveyard, so you might flip the Duskmangler from that. But Graveyard Shift, bringing it back into play and potentially even at instant speed, is just a really nice combo to assemble. Next is the combo between Involuntary Employment and any sacrifice effects. Casualty is a great example, but basically you steal your opponent's creature, get a treasure token, and then you can attack your opponent with that creature and then sacrifice it to one of your other cards to just really use Involuntary Employment as a removal spell, which can be quite powerful. And since there are quite a few ways to sacrifice creatures, thanks to the casualty mechanic, the Involuntary Employment becomes a really nice combo piece. And then finally, there is a combo between Glittermonger and Stimulus Package. Oftentimes, once you have all of your mana sorted and you're in the late game, making treasure tokens doesn't really do much. But if you have a Stimulus Package in your deck, if you're continually churning out those treasure tokens with your Glittermongers, eventually, if you draw Stimulus Package, you'll just be able to make a bunch of 1/1 tokens to win the late game. Next up, we're going to be covering the mana fixing. It's really important in a 3-color set. So we're going to be starting off with these 3-color fetch lands, which fetch you one of the basic lands associated with that family and also can gain you a life. It's worth noting you don't have to just play these in the families that they are like named for. You can also just play them in any of the families that have overlap. So for example, if you are playing a Maestro's deck that is blue, black, red, you can totally play an Obscura Storefront, which can fetch you up an island or a swamp that you still need for your blue, black, red deck. You don't need to be able to get every single land. It's still quite valuable. These are very good lands, and the fact that they gain you a life does help you stabilize, especially if you're playing a slower deck. Next up are the creatures that can make your lands tap for 3 colors. There is one of these in each of the families as well, and they're quite nice for helping your mana early. They aren't necessarily as good if you're playing more than just the 3 colors because they're going to be hard to cast outside of the particular family that they're in, but they are quite nice in the families to help you facilitate mana early and then also be a strong late game play because they're all just solid creatures on their own. Next are the 5 allied tap lands. These are great lands as well because they help your mana early and then you can sacrifice them in the late game. There are 5 of them for the allied color combos. They don't have them for the enemy color combos, but they are still quite nice to have access to for your decks. And then finally, there is Ominous Parcel, which can search for a basic land card as its 2 mana ability. And there's also a bunch of treasure generating creatures or other cards that you can use to help fix your mana as well. So be aware of the mana fixing. It is really important to build decks with good mana. Final tips, be careful with your mana. As I was just saying, color screw can be mitigated with proper deck building. Oftentimes, it's good to have like 2 colors as a main focus and then a 3rd color that you're dipping into, especially in these 3-color sets. If you are going to be ambitious and go for more than 3 colors, make sure that you are really prioritizing those lands that can get multiple colors so you don't just play a really weird split of basic lands and end up with only like 5 sources of one of your key colors. So make sure that you are careful with your mana. It can be crazy in these environments where they're incentivizing you to play 3 colors with all these cards, but you do want to make sure that you are keeping your deck reasonable so that you don't just lose a bunch of games to a color screw. And then finally, small creatures stay useful because they can knock off shield counters or be sacrificed for casualty. I mentioned this when I was talking about specific small creatures, but just generally, if you do have a little creature, maybe don't chump block as aggressively, or maybe just keep it around so that you can use it to your other effects that have casualty, or if your opponent plays a big card with shield, because those little creatures remain more useful than they might in other formats. Well, that is going to do it for this draft guide. Thank you so much for watching, and remember to like the video, subscribe, and comment with your questions and feedback. And if you did make it all the way to the end, let me know by leaving hashtag Streetwise in the comments section down below. I hope you're feeling more prepared for your next new Capenna draft, but if you want a little bit of extra content to help get you ready, you can check out the NicolaiBolas Patreon at patreon.com/NicolaiBolas to support my content and gain access to my draft tier list as an additional resource. I've ranked every card in the set on an A through F scale, so if you're looking for a little bit of an extra tool to get you ready to crush your foes, then that could be the thing for you, and you're also supporting my content and helping me make more videos in the process. Anyway, that is going to do it for this draft guide. I do hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you on the streets.